Welcome to our session on ethics. Well, it is a pleasure. I thought we will be only the speakers, so it is a pleasure to have all you over here. We will have a little bit more time because the last speaker, Armando Napolitano, had some family problems and couldn't come. So that will leave us a little bit more time. We will begin with Armanda C. She will speak about climate engineering prioritization. Oh, okay. A new topic. Okay. She will tell us what she's going to speak about. So the floor is yours. I don't know if you sent. Okay, perfect.
Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Amanda C. And I am a sociology PhD candidate at Rutgers University. And the title now of my talk is going to be the social construction of risk in SRM research. So, let me start that. All right, yeah, so today I'll be presenting mostly on a theoretical discussion of risk, which is why I don't have slides. And so let me tell you for the past few years what I've been doing, which is that I've been following this field of SRM research because I've been interested in the role that technology currently plays in the relationship between society and the environment. So I've been attending meetings and conferences such as this one, and I've been interviewing mostly climate scientists and engineers, as well as a handful of social scientists who are trying to figure out this question of what SRM might look like in our climate future. And so one of the most important themes that I've seen central to SRM research is the concept of risks and uncertainties, not surprising to everyone here. And in my discussions with researchers in this field, there's almost unanimous agreement that one of the main reasons to pursue SRM research is to identify potential risks and benefits, reduce uncertainties about what would happen when and if SRM methods are used. While there are very interesting scientific questions about climate physics and modeling, SRM is so unique from other areas of climate research precisely because at its core is an ethical question: should we do something or not? Oftentimes, SRM researchers have told me that their role isn't to answer the question of whether or not we should deploy SRM. Instead, their role is to provide enough information to allow others to assess whether or not we should deploy SRM. My hot take is that I think this is a slightly misled way of viewing the role of the researcher. Because the kinds of information you are hoping to provide is to help decision makers balance the risks and benefits and the uncertainties related to each, we are in essence every day making decisions about how the risks of SRM are going to be perceived. Furthermore, we are also every day making decisions about which risks to study based on what we think is risky. Research is never separate from the ethical decision-making of SRM deployment. The research itself is one of the many social processes that are tied up in that decision-making. Not just the research questions you choose, but the methods we use, the data we gather and analyze, the funding mechanisms for this research, and the people involved are all shaped in the way that SRM risks are perceived and understood. So this gets to the main point I want to make today, which is that risk is socially constructed. In this presentation, I'll introduce some sociological perspectives on risk that help us better understand the social complexities in addition to the underlying goal of determining risks and uncertainties of SRM. After introducing these theoretical perspectives, I'll try to highlight some implications for SRM ethics and governance, although this part is going to be very preliminary as I'm still working this out myself in my dissertation. But of course, I want to at least try to touch on them since that is the theme of this session. And so I would love your feedback on whether the implications I discuss ring useful for you or if you think I just sound crazy. So I will center this talk around the theories of Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, two sociologists who converged on theories of modernity and risk, specifically revealing the unique socially constructed nature of risk, especially in a post-industrialized society. I'll start with Beck's concept of the risk society, which is one of the most useful ways for understanding why we are in the mess we are in the first place. Beck first introduced this concept of the risk society in 1992, in which he argued that we exist in a unique era of experiencing dangers and threats to ourselves and our communities. In the pre pre-industrial era, societies mostly experienced the world's dangers as something that is out there or an act of God. Climatic changes like storms, floods, and droughts were seen as uncontrollable and unknowable. This changes with the scientific revolution and industrialization, where there is more of an optimistic shift towards understanding these dangers and threats. The studies of risk and the studies of classical sociology actually developed separately, as risks were seen as technically defined probabilities multiplied with magnitudes of events that could benefit or harm human beings, cultural artifacts, and ecosystems. This is seen as a framework of risks that I actually sometimes see guiding SRM research. As Lidskog and Sundquist describe, citing risk scholar Ariella Amendola, this approach, quote, implies that one set of experts establishes the probability and magnitudes of the hazards, for example, of SRM, and another set of experts evaluates the costs and benefits of various options for society. Thereafter, the political priorities are invoked in order to make decisions on regulating, forbidding, controlling, permitting certain risks. So in other words, this is the classical model of thinking about risk assessment that I've sometimes seen described in the SRM community. However, not only does this model of risk assessment leave out the broader social, cultural, and historical context of risks, but also Beck argues that we are actually no longer in this stage, and instead we are in a late modern era, aka the risk society. So what defines the risk society? First, it is difficult to continuously quantify and measure risk using probabilistic methods. Of course, you all kind of inherently know this just from working with climate models. However, Beck also argues that the societal creations and configurations of human-made technologies and institutions grow and compound the threats and dangers to communities and to individuals. Quote, along with the growing capacities of technical options grows the incalculability of their consequences, end quote. So for Beck, the incalculable and also materially imperceptible risk of ever-scaling technologies are what drives second modernity, in other words, the risk society. SRM is a great example of this modern type of risk in that we cannot even conduct a full-scale experiment with controls to understand the effects of injecting different particles into the atmosphere, as well as the fact that, if we actually did it, you wouldn't be able to see it. It'd be even more difficult to attribute any changes to SRM. Organization scholar Charles Perrault additionally illustrates the complexities created by modern socio-technical systems that risk assessments fail to capture. Perrault argued that these systems now carry the risks of what he called normal accidents, and that's accidents that are near inevitable. That they cannot be determined just by traditional risk assessments that are now inherent features of modernity and technology, especially when these systems are highly complex, tightly coupled, and have catastrophic potential. And I'll return to assessing SRM using this concept in a moment for discussing ethical implications. To return to Beck and Giddens, though, they even more usefully identified why risk society fundamentally alters the relationship between institutions, such as centers of scientific knowledge, and the public. Both argue that people are now extremely aware of threats self-inflicted by socio-technical systems that could lead to inevitable normal accidents. This is a drastically different experience of risk when compared to the days when most of the threats that you or your community were external or from God. So this is something that I am constantly observing amongst members of this SRM community, in which we all lament society's failures to properly mitigate greenhouse gases, something that everyone here is aware is human-caused. And this leads to another aspect of the risk society that Beck describes, which he calls reflexive modernization. This is the idea that in the risk society, we have a heightened awareness that mastery of knowing all risks is impossible. This is a phrase that he and Giddens borrowed from the sociologist Bruno Latour. The consequence of this heightened awareness is that everyday people become disenchanted in the stability and strength of its own institutions. This is a phenomenon folks have already been referencing all week, whether it be related to climate change in general, the geopolitical turn to populism, the defunding of sciences in America and their recent Make America Healthy great wave, but even in the mundane, everyday anxieties about the feelings of insecurities about our families, work, and Social Security. It's important to note that this lack of trust in institutions is not necessarily because people are unaware or uneducated. Instead, Beck argues, we are actually highly aware of all the self-inflicted risks brought on by modernity, causing increased anxiety about our individual safety, our previously taken for granted social norms and institutions, and about our future trajectory. The existence of SRM as a field of research is in many ways an example of reflexive modernization. Once again, Lidskog and Sundquist describe Beck's understanding that, quote, reflexive modernization leads to an unbinding of science and politics, end quote, by demystifying and demonopolizing scientific knowledge claims. SRM research is, again, a great example of this because it has burst through old taboos in climate research that long kept SRM research at the fringes, not necessarily in order to challenge claims about climate change itself, but instead what I'm seeing is that the SRM community is trying to change norms about what kinds of risk work you should and want to do. In adopting this, what I think this is an ethical stance about the future of climate risks. And SRM researchers are reorienting the goals and boundaries of what it means to be a climate researcher. This is where I'm seeing ethics emerge. Almost every SRM researcher I've spoken to are doing this not just because it's interesting science, but also because they feel an obligation to address climate change risks. It is a direct response to the failures of the state, civil society, and corporations to address climate change. So this leads me to one of the first implications for how I think this community needs to think about their role in our climate future. The first is an issue I've heard from many members of this community and that we've been hearing about all week, which is that of legitimacy and trust. By understanding risk as a social construction, that means that we actually need to view legitimacy and trust of the entire enterprise of SRM research and of the climate problem in general as a risk issue as well. It is not just one of communication, as I've often heard echoed at conferences like these, and it would not necessarily be solved by just having a robust governance mechanism to drive research priorities. We should not think of public perception and public acceptance of SRM as something that needs to be managed to match scientific understandings of risk and benefits. Instead, we must recognize that the scientific process itself is a social process. Scientific organizations themselves are constructing new risks because they are constantly managing the fluctuating, oft-contested questions that we see on display at conferences such as this one. Thus, risk perception, legitimacy, and trust are not just something that should be relegated to the realm of social scientists, something we will manage while climate modelers and engineers figure out the risks. Instead, I think that risk analysis, assessment, and communication are not separate realms, but instead tied up together in an ongoing social processes. So I want to take a step back from that and look at how I've seen SRM researchers constructing risks so far. I've observed this happening through a few major framings, and right now I'll focus on one specific framing, which is framing SRM risk in relation to climate change risks, in other words, a risk analysis. Many would agree this is a sensible approach, and I've seen through my interviews in the literature that this framing is one that was developed amongst technical climate scientists, social scientists, policy experts, and philosophers. However, I think additional work may need to be done with this framing given what I've just discussed. First, I think that understanding risk using Perot's normal accidents framework might challenge a straightforward risk-risk framework. Although it may intuitively make sense to compare the risks of a future of unmitigated anthropogenic climate change with the risks of a future with climate change plus SRM, the phrase risk-risk can unfortunately mask the multiplicative complexities that adding SRM into the climate system might introduce, as well as adding an additional layer of coupling into the climate system. The possibility of catastrophic potential holds an important sociological element here. Perot previously invoked the example of nuclear disasters. Here, termination shock is often a significant concern as an example of catastrophic potential. And while some have argued that is unlikely to happen if we were to ramp up SRM slowly, the existence of termination shock in and of itself has already become a cultural symbol that cannot just be managed away. Instead, I think we need to work on a risk framework that clearly articulates the additional multiplicative complexities and coupling with the introduction of SRM into a warming world. Further, conferences such as this one, such as the Degrees Forum, reveals the complexity of a risk-risk framing. Researchers have told me with the growth of impacts research in SRM, with many global regions beginning to explore how SRM would influence their region's varied interests, it is already difficult to imagine how there would be a global consensus about balancing every region's risks and benefits. At previous conferences, I've heard discussion of extending loss and damages to regions that might be negatively affected by SRM deployment. But I'm skeptical that would really take into consideration the many ways in which different societies and communities perceive climate risks and dangers, including the difficulties of quantifying values and forms of justice, which of course are bound up in what is considered a risk. I don't, at this point, have any specific suggestions for how to specifically articulate a risk framing that captures these issues, but I am hoping to continue to work on this. Please let me know if you had any ideas. Another implication that I want to discuss, the final one, is that so many people here have been calling for more governance mechanisms to legitimize, guide, and fund SRM research. For example, the Off-Site NASEM report aimed to start a conversation on how to responsibly and ethically guide SRM research in the US. Billy will be presenting later on similar frameworks at the AGU. And I wanted to add on to this to advocate for risk governance that allows us to think of SRM and SRM governance as fundamentally a risk problem, attendant with all the social construction aspects I discussed here. Hermans, Fox, and Van Aslet summarized from Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy that risk governance involves a paradigm shift that does not try to claim that we will have some level of certainty in the future or any capability of minimizing risks from SRM or climate change, but instead accepts uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think this is something that I have been seeing addressed during this week, which I really think is something that needs to continue to develop. And additionally, I believe SRM researchers need to view themselves as something that people will always be worried about, not take it personally, and align with risk frameworks and governance mechanisms that accept responsibility for creating and maintaining climate risk. Even if you think that unilateral deployment isn't likely or possible, except for the US or China, even if you think the moral hazard isn't quote unquote real, even if you think that critics are just putting their heads in the sand on this topic, I do not think that that absolves anyone here of our role in the active creation of SRM risks, whether or not we want it to be deployed. So I'll quickly summarize. SRM research is not just an attempt to guide decision makers into understanding what the risks and benefits of deployment should be. Instead, I think that risk construction means that we are embedded in a long history of climate science within institutions and using methods that have largely driven modern anxieties and risk perceptions about knowledge and technology. Although the counter-climate change movement driven by the fossil fuel industry is real and insidious, the fact that we are responding to their mistakes means that we cannot view ourselves as outside of their risk-making, but instead part and parcel of how society views climate risk in general. There's an enormous legitimacy and trust crisis that cannot just be earned by being transparent about good science. I believe that instead we need to revisit current risk frameworks, as well as embracing risk governance paradigms that center reflexivity under uncertainty. Thank you so much, and I look forward to learning more throughout this week.
I would suggest that you stay. If there are some questions, we still have some time or comments. So.
Okay, we'll do Q&A one at a time.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
So people don't forget.
Okay. Yeah, what's fresh? Yeah.
First question is really practical. You mentioned a report.
Oh, NASEM report. National Academy of Science. Yeah, it was from 2021. It was about governance of SRM and SRM research.
Regarding, so I've just been reading this paper on like practical non-epistemic values that actually play a role in early SRM sort of research, and the fact that basically people are like, when you decide to choose a local model versus a regional model, like versus a global model, or you choose to focus on temperature reduction rather than precipitation, like there's lots of uncertainty.
Yes.
In that. And do you see a way of overcoming these? And it seems like there's like no translation model to make this, to reduce this uncertainty for policymakers.
Yeah.
It seems like the climate science community just embraces this.
Right.
What is there a risk for science policy? It's like almost like an uncrossable bridge.
Right. So this is the part where, like, I think most of the time people in the community are just like, we just have to communicate how we think about uncertainties. And so that's where I'm trying to like intervene, is like, it's not just about communication, right? It's about embedding the fact in and of itself into decision making, into governance, and like just telling the public like, well, that's just how the science works, like, isn't going to be enough. Like, that has been the case for all decisions, like in public health, like that's the example that always comes to my mind. But like, and like, I don't have clear answers for the mechanisms of how to do that, but like, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, right?
Just because it seems like within the model of like building an evidence base for SRM, you don't have like a clinical trial that gives you
exactly, yeah, and that's what.
And you know, it's got the efficacy safety thing profile is good.
Right.
We don't kind of have that anymore.
Right, exactly. So that's where I think the risk governance like paradigm shift comes into like I don't think there's a way of like fixing that because that's just how probabilistic methods work, right? And so I think that's what I mean by accepting uncertainty, accepting ambiguity, and then I heard some talk yesterday about like having reflexive governance mechanisms that kind of like are constantly like readjusting in light of like these kinds of issues. But I'm like that's where I'm still working it out as well.
I think there was
It was earlier at the plenary, someone had asked a question that popped up on the screen if global north can export technologies to the global south. And I wonder if the development of interventions with global north money, since we are causing global warming, but together in cooperation with global south could be this type of technology. And furthermore, David Heath said today that poor and hot regions benefit the most from SRM. Is it kind of, is our interventions accidentally, in a sense, aligned with climate justice if the global south stands to benefit?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I think like, yeah, I definitely like bracketed out the climate justice question here. But I think that, they go hand in hand, right? Like if you're thinking about, like if you only used probably like very straightforward risk assessment to try to like judge climate justice, you would leave out like a billion things related to climate justice, right? So, in that sense, like if you use a number like X number of deaths will be reduced in X place, and that's my climate justice like assessment, then like I'm like that's not enough. Obviously, that doesn't involve all the social processes that go behind climate injustices, and so I think that like that goes hand in hand with a more reflexive style of like risk framework and risk governance. But there's so much to talk about there. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up though.
There are two more questions, so I will take them together because we have only 5 minutes. Because if not, we won't have time for the rest.
So I had a question about normal accidents.
Yeah.
And so if it's interactional complexity, coupling, and catastrophic failure,
Yeah.
if you bucket all that together, then it seems as if you make safety interventions, it actually makes it more brittle, the whole system.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what I'm wondering is how that connects to SRM generally, and also whether or not, like, then we have to accept a lack of safety, that safety is impossible. And if that would then change our risk perception generally, if there will be some sort of like value or perception shift in our general societal acceptance or of risk, like we might become more reckless or something like this.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh well, we ran that risk, we'll run these other risks. Something like that.
And let's.
Yes, I would like to build on Tim's question about uncertainty. You said, you made a very good point saying that it's not just about how we communicate uncertainties, but have you explored how policymakers can make better decisions, including the uncertainties of climate models, and particularly in SRM, because there are many, many uncertainties that are not just about the climate or the physical dimension, but also social, political.
Yeah. A big question. Yeah, I can. So let me answer these in order. So the first question about normal accidents. Yeah, so that's a literature and like area that I actually don't know that much about. But so I'm not like, I think like Perot like had suggestions in terms of like the role of experts at different levels of decision making within an organization, being able to like reduce hierarchical decision making and things like that. But that's within like a specific organization, like a power plant in his example. So I'm not like 1,000%. I like really don't know how that like scales to SRM decision making, but like that's like maybe a principle about involving experts. And I think I did kind of try to get to that, as like involving experts like people who are doing modeling, but then like obviously like all other types of experts who are in conferences like this at all levels of decision making, you know, and that's what I mean by like not just like giving your data to decision makers and be like, you make the decision. That's like, so I think that is sort of something that like Perot was kind of offering as a way to deal with normal accidents. I think there are other suggestions that I'm not as familiar with, but that's just one example. And then for your question about, policymakers dealing with uncertainties, I think that's what I was trying to get at with like embracing risk governance and kind of reflexive governance. And I know that's like kind of like a strange term, but like I think it's something that, and once again, that's like something that is not necessarily within the scope right now for me of like determining what those mechanisms are, but I know that like people in the risk governance area like have already been working on that. So that's one area I want to like eventually try to pull in to find specific examples. But like that's definitely like I also have the same question as you. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce María Inés Carabajal. She will speak about fostering ethical governance on solar radiation modification. She's from the University of Buenos Aires.
I have slides.
Yeah, I imagine that.
Hi, everyone. My name is María Inés Carabajal from Argentina. Okay, thank you. I'm part of a team working on ethics and public perceptions of SRM in Argentina, and we are trying to analyze and explore the ethical, political, and social dimensions of SRM from a Latin American and the Caribbean perspectives. So this presentation builds on a paper we submitted last month, a month ago, titled No Governance is Governance, Mapping Solar Geoengineering Discussions in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this paper is a collaborative effort of an interdisciplinary team of scientists from Argentina. So what we will share today are initial reflections on the states of SRM, governance, ethics, and the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we would like to situate this analysis within the broader international debate on these emerging technologies. Okay, so we begin with the central paradox. The absence of regulation for solar radiation modification of SRM in Latin America and the Caribbean is itself a form of governance. But how can states and regional institutions can take meaningful action when they lack both scientific information and localized expertise? So this gap risks reinforcing mistrust, reviving perception of climate colonialism, and restricting potentially valuable research. So one illustrative example is the controversial Make Sunset case, which we argue was not ethically justifiable. So in 2023, a startup called Make Sunset performed a small-scale non-research intervention or non-research deployment of SRM in Baja California, Mexico, without prior permission or community engagement. Their actions led the Mexican government to announce its intention to ban SRM experimentation and research, highlighting the need for governance mechanisms to avoid irresponsible practices that could undermine legitimate SRM endeavors. In response to that, we offer a foundational and participatory recommendations to help shape transparent, effective, and inclusive SRM governance in the region, one that ensures that Latin American countries are active participants in global conversations. So our methodology to address these challenges is a mix of media coverage analysis, and ethical perspectives. So first, we make a diagnosis to identify governance gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then we examine the Make Sunset case using academic literature and media sources like English and Spanish outlets. Then we adopted a broad and inclusive definitions of risk and analyzed how the media frame the case across English and Spanish information or platforms. We also included an ethical analysis stressing the importance of public engagement in climate governance. Finally, we developed concrete recommendations for a more inclusive and anticipatory SRM governance model. So here we have the Make Sunset case. As I said earlier, in 2023, this U.S. startup released sulfur aerosols in Baja California, Mexico, without consultation or official permission. So Mexico responded by banning SRM experimentations. We interpret this case using Felgenauer's definition in his framework. It's Felgenauer et al., because there are many authors that build this risk analysis to analyze SRM within a broad climate risk landscape. So the definition of risk that Felgenauer et al. Include in this risk analysis is the U.S. Department. And it says it's the potential for an unwanted outcome resulting from an incident or event based on its likelihood and consequences. So we believe that this case exposed not only environmental and scientific uncertainties, but also ethical and geopolitical risk, especially regarding the unequal impacts and the potential for conflicts and deepened global inequalities. So we know that solar geoengineering, particularly stratospheric aerosol injection, seeks to reflect sunlight to cool the planet. We know that decarbonization must be prioritized in this context, but research is expanding and is accelerating. So the LAC region in the global context remains largely absent from these discussions. Governments are not familiar with this technology, and SRM is not yet a priority in discussions. So the risks of SRM are manifold. Uneven regional effects, persistent scientific uncertainties, and profound ethical and governance dilemmas. So understanding this risk from a local and regional perspective is essential to determine the legitimacy of any SRM action. Actually, there is no current global governance of SRM, right? We know that there is no natural place for this issue to be discussed. While concerns are growing, most governance initiatives stem from academic institutions in the global north, and this includes a lack of global legal framework, minimal participation of global south countries, and sporadic and uncoordinated capacity building efforts. All the capacity building activities that have been made in the region are not sufficient to address the complexity of the problem. So we need more information, we need more capacities to raise our voice in the international discussions. Within Latin America and the Caribbean, SRM is not a priority, it's not part of climate change strategies or a portfolio of climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. There is low public awareness, minimal research infrastructure, and little institutional engagement. So what's urgently needed in this landscape that I described? A stronger local expertise, access to trustworthy information about SRM, and participatory governance structures to manage and deal with these emerging technologies and unpredictable developments. And why this is important, why this matters? The Make Sunset case triggered scientific and media scrutiny. Yeah? The media condemns the Make Sunset case, highlighting that there is a governance vacuum.
To understand how the case was framed, we analyzed news coverage from 2022 to 2024 in both English and Spanish. We use Hollyback's framework for assessing representations of geoengineering in the media. Here you can see a graphic. The table that you can see with the type of risk summarize the different types of risk that we were able to identify in the media analysis. But also they are not isolated. They are intertwined risk that shows the landscape of risk and how we can start to identify it and then dealing and manage this kind of risk within this broad conception of SRM, impacts, and risk. And in the other hand, you can see the percentage distribution of different types of risk expressed in perceptions captured in the media. So this is important because we would like to understand what are the main risks captured by the media, because there are some media from US platforms, other from Latin America, and how they are connected, how they perceive, because we understand that media shape public perception. So how it shapes and how it form public opinion is really important for public perception and public engagement. So, makes sense, as I said earlier, our analysis show that the media condemns Make Sunset and portray the action as acting irresponsible without scientific legitimacy, public consent, or transparency. This raised the alarm, not just about the risks themselves, but about the lack of governance structures to prevent unilateral climate interventions. Some narratives explicitly invoke climate colonialism, a concern that we take really seriously when considering SRM governance within power asymmetries and power structures between Global North and Global South. We made also an ethical analysis of Make Sunset. While often referred to as an experiment, Make Sunset experiment, we believe it is a commercial deployment, not scientific research. So for clarity, we define SRM experiment as any deliberate intervention lacking sufficient evidence for safe or effective use. These distinctions matters. Without transparency or oversight, commercial ventures or commercial capitals like Make Sunset raise serious ethical concerns. They blur the lines between experimentation and deployment, bypassing democratic processes. What are the implications for governance and public engagement? So, all this case around Make Sunset and the role of Latin American countries in this process bring us to one of our core arguments. Ethical governance requires both robust public engagement and public participation. And why engage the public? Because it builds transparency and trust. Because it ensures decision reflects local values and are context-based. It strengthens democratic legitimacy. Effective governance must be inclusive, context-sensitive, and committed to epistemic justice, recognizing diverse forms of knowledge and ways of knowing and connecting to the world. So these are our main conclusions. We would like to hear your feedback if you want to ask questions or if you have any comments. The first one is that Make Sunset, this case underscores that the lack of regulation is not neutrality. It's a governance choice that leaves the door open for unethical actions. The Latin America and the Caribbean region must not remain on the sidelines because it increases vulnerability. Strengthening regional capacity and institutional knowledge is key to ensuring meaningful participation in shaping SRM governance. Strengthening the rules to distinguish between research and non-research deployment and what is an intervention is key to clarify the responsibilities of private actors, governments, scientists, and NGO. Finally, we emphasize that culturally responsive public engagement is not optional. It's essential for legitimate and ethical research governance. Okay, thank you.
We have 5 minutes more for questions, comments, before we have our last speaker. Okay, and then.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's really interesting. I was just wondering, so to me it seems that a lot in your presentation hinges on being the public engagement, and very specifically using public engagement to build legitimacy. This is coming from a political science perspective and not a philosophy. To build legitimacy is a very different thing than having actual influence on decision-making processes, right? Or building trust doesn't necessarily equal decision-making processes. So you're in your final sort of 2 bullets. You have them all as a list. But do you have a priority there? Like, are you really looking for meaningful participation? Are you looking for public trust? Are you looking for the legitimacy of political decision-making? Because I think there might be tension between those kind of things.
Let's see the other question, and you answer all.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell more about how Mexico relates today to SRM. That today view it as something that potentially could be deployed responsibly in the future, or are they now strongly against it?
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Well, it's a very good question. Thank you very much for bringing it. I think that we are newcomers in the field. We have been working on this topic for the last year, and we are starting to work with public perception of SRM, with field work. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm working with communities. That is my background. So we have different levels here. This is our first paper, so that's the reason why we would like to share your feedback. I think that communication is not enough. For me, I have this idea of co-production of knowledge. And co-production means bring to the table different expertise, different social and institutional actors that can share perspectives and produce knowledge all together. This is a slow process in which you build trust, you build relationships and meaningful engagement. So this is a long process. This will take time. But that is the one aspect of the problem. The other dimension is how we influence decision-making. Currently, in the Latin American and the Caribbean countries, we lack expertise. We don't have the expertise. There are some groups funded by the Degrees initiatives, but I believe it's not sufficient to address the complexity of the problem. We need policy brief in Spanish, information in Spanish, maybe different teams working not only in the modeling, but also in the socio-political and communication and public engagement at the same time. But this is a complex process. And we are starting to build all that expertise. And in the future, we would like to strengthen relationships with policymakers. For example, here at the Degrees Forum, there were many sessions to interact with policymakers. So we received their concerns or their recommendations on what to do, how we can improve this relationship, but it's not easy. It takes time, you have to build trust. So it's a very complex process that we need to continue working on. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but... Okay, great. And Mexico, well, I think they just announced, right, the ban on SRM experimentation. But then the government changed, that the government administration change. So we have to wait and see. But I think another question that we have is to what extent this banning could perform a negative perspective of SRM within the region. If other countries will do the same or not. How we can regulate private companies that can undermine legitimate endeavors of SRM in the region. So I think it's a negative case that we would like to bring to the table to discuss how we can monitor and oversee the whole process. And also how we can build mechanisms to regulate and monitor.
No, we don't have. Sorry.
We can talk in the break.
Yes. And so our last speaker is Dr. Billy Williams. He will speak about ethical horizons, navigating climate intervention solutions with care.
So my slides in here someplace. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I really like this conference. Again, I'm Billy Williams. I'm from the American Geophysical Union. And when we first started discussions about ethical framework to help guide climate intervention research, we got a lot of pushback. And I can tell you that some of the pushback was around, what's your role in this? Why are you doing this? And now it's being accepted and discussed very broadly, as you see in this conference. My role in this, again, my title is Executive Vice President for Ethics and Organizational Advancement. I'm not an ethicist. I'm an organic chemist by training. I've worked for AGU for 12 years now. But one of my roles at AGU has been involved in advancing science, scientific publications, meetings, and other things. And in that role, I've helped establish ethical practices as one of AGU's key values. So today I'll give you some background on our roles and actions around ethical framework for climate geoengineering, some key messages about what we've done and how it's been perceived. I will leave you with what we're calling 5 proposed ethical framework principles to govern this space. And then I'll talk a little bit about outreach and next steps. This background, you notice already, it's been, this is 2015, everybody was celebrating what happened on the Paris Agreement. And as you all know already, people were celebrating then because it was the first time we had governments agreeing to have some reporting on a regular basis. But the challenge is that those emission reduction goals are not being met. And in 2022, an IPCC report found that there's general scientific agreement that we may need dramatic reductions in global CO2 emissions combined with active removal of legacy carbon from the atmosphere. So that's not SRM, but we'll tie these all together. But there is an urgency here. There's a continued urgency. And one of the things I think the previous speakers talked about was how long it takes when you start talking about some of these engagement principles. It is a long process, but you're better off for doing this. So I just listed some highlights, some recent public headlines. You might recognize some of these headlines. And a lot of these are around SRM-related activities. However, the work that I'm presenting here today applies more broadly to other forms of technological interventions that are being proposed. AGU is the world's largest organization of Earth and space scientists, and so we have people working in this space across oceans, across atmospheric interventions potentially, and with an organization this large, we have people with very strongly held opinions in this space. So we're trying to influence our organization and more globally, beyond AGU membership, what should happen in this space. So the need is here, and here I'm just saying this is a diagram. I don't want to go into this because this is about the various geoengineering methods that have been debated and proposed. But our position statement at AGU is this. There's the urgent priority of a healthy climate, and it does require enhanced climate intervention research and community engagement. This is not saying anything about deployment. This is about a need for research. So we strongly hold a position there's a need for research. And more strongly, ethical guidance is needed. When this work first started, there was not a lot of discussion around the ethics, but as you see in this conference, it's front and center in all of the discussions now. So there's a lot of progress being made. So in October 2022, in partnerships with others, we started, well, this is for the white paper, the initiative was started in 2022. And in our initiative to get to some broadly held or some things that people could lean into, that our engagement on this topic, we made sure we were doing this in a way that was inclusive, representative, and just. So we brought in a lot of different voices from across the globe as we were developing these principles. We want to do this in a way that we did not imply or make deployment inevitable, that we would not undermine efforts to reduce carbon emissions, and that we wanted to assure public participation and consultation in the development of these principles. And we did that through a lot of convenings and call for public comments. I'm not saying it was a perfect process. It was far from that, but we did proactively go out of our way to seek broad input on these principles. We also appointed and had a global advisory board and invited some expert authors to help us get to a final product here. So a little bit about the advisory board role. So I was part of the project team leading this effort to develop these principles. There was an advisory board to provide overall guidance to the initiative. And so we had recognized leaders from across the globe, transdisciplinary at all career stages, over 40. Not all of these were physical scientists, some were ethicists, and some were policymakers. So we thought we had a good combination. I'll show you some of those individuals shortly. And then once we had a set of preliminary principles, we invited in expert authors because the project team were not people who were experts in the science. We were there, we had more policy and public interaction expertise. So the invited authors provided critical review and input on crafting the final principles. They were recognized experts, and we said that the invited authors could not be advisory board members. So I'll go through and just show you photos of who were advisory board members. You'll see many of these people at this conference. Some of these you will recognize. Many of these you will recognize. Some may even be in this room. That's page 1. And page 2, additional individuals who are part of the advisory board, giving feedback and input through reviewing drafts of the framework principles and other engagement, primarily through Zoom meetings and at our annual meetings. I will mention that there were 5 early career scientists that were members of this advisory board as well, and they had an equal voice at the table. So I'm just listing you here the names of, by first name alphabetically, the names of the 12 invited authors. You will recognize, you might recognize some of these names. Again, some of these are at this conference. A lot of these are at this conference. And some. So again, we had a good collection of individuals giving us advice on how to take this forward. And again, it wasn't a perfect process, but we're very proud of the results, and now we're getting good engagements. So there's a precedent for this. This is not the first time there have been ethical principles proposed to guide climate geoengineers. The ones at the bottom, the Oxford Principles, Tollgate Principles, Salomar Conference in 2010. UNESCO now has an ethics of climate and geoengineering. So there's an assortment of principles there. I think what is different in our process was the process we went through to get to these, and also the heavy emphasis you will see on the justice component, which were not present in some of the early ones from 2009 and 2010. But also, you will see we cited and we did reference back some principles that were put in place to guide emerging technologies. So we treated this like an emerging technologies where the community itself needs to come together and say, okay, what is it that we're willing to do to put guardrails on ourselves? And this has happened in the development of CRISPR technology, human cloning, and some other aspects. So the ethical framework, targeted audience. So we have produced a report with some ethical framework recommendations, and the target audiences for those are researchers, policymakers, funders, and the global public at large. So you will see this report is written in a way that it can connect with those audiences and with key messages for each of those audiences. So we condensed these down to 5 ethical framework principles, and they're available in a report that's available for download. I'll give you the address to find it. It's easy to find, download for free. It's available in 10 different languages, translated in 10 different languages. So this is the summary of all of that. The 5 key principles are around responsible research, the need for principle-based pursuit of climate intervention as a public good, not so much as a means to make profit. Holistic climate justice, and there are a number of different sub-principles under holistic climate justice, and I won't go into all of those, but you can read the report and reference those. It's sort of a tutorial on what holistic climate justice means that's found in the report. Cooperative public participation, you've heard the previous 2 speakers talk a lot about that, the imperative of public participation in decision-making around climate intervention research. Some of the early pushback we got when we first published or proposed principles was that you're going to slow us down. This is an urgent problem. We don't have time to go do all this public engagement. Nonsense is what is being called. And I think based on the actions they've seen, the public react and say, you can't do this without talking to us. You can't slip stuff in and go do some things without engaging the public. So that public participation is really critical. The transparency. You have to disclose what's happening. And that's another one of these elements that you would assume that we as scientists would know to do so, but you saw in the movie last night and in other places that hasn't always happened. And then informed governance, that potential consequences should be independently assessed ahead of time, and possible large-scale testing or deployment should only be considered after governance monitoring and regulation systems are agreed to and in place. And then for those principles, within the report, as we translate this and take this out, we translate, when we're talking to different audiences, we translate those principles into, okay, what does it mean for me as a funder if I'm looking at those principles? What does it mean for me as a policymaker? What does it mean for me as a researcher? So, and I'm just giving examples here of what it means for funders. I'm not giving examples for each of those key audiences. But for funders, for example, in Principle 1, funders should ensure research, by definition, assesses risk as well as any benefits of the method at issue. Funders should ensure that research teams include social scientists or ethicists who can integrate moral concepts of justice and fairness. You should not have a research team working in this space, is our recommendation, that does not include social scientists or other people with a broader view of the need and impacts in this space, as opposed to I'm a physicist, I'm a researcher, and I got my team here, we're just going to go do this stuff and scale it up and make things happen. You need to have a broader view on the impacts. Funders should ensure that public participation is integrated in research, including assessment by the communities that may be affected by these activities. I think a funder has a responsibility to require the research team to assure that they have public participation built into their strategies. Funding should be completely transparent so that the public can know what the motivations are. And then finally, funders can ensure that research is pursued incrementally, ensuring accountability at each stage. Elected councils, panels, or other bodies of public representation can serve as effective mechanisms for this accountability. One of the recommendations we make is that we think institutions should consider bodies like the institutional review boards that are in place when you want to do human subject type research. We think having institutional review boards in place when you're starting to do potential large-scale research in the environment. There are a few additional important key report messages. First is there's no bright line between small-scale intervention research and large-scale needing ethical principles. Ethical principles should be considered at every stage, including when you're modeling. What is it that you're modeling? So, and people have asked, okay, where do you draw the line? There is no bright line. So you just have to have the discussions and decide how much you lean in on some of these items. Independent advisory boards, that's what I just mentioned, are recommended practices to help assure proper governance of outdoor climate intervention research. Adoption of ethical principles will help advance public acceptance of climate intervention research rather than slow its progress. And that was one of the critiques we got initially, that we don't have time for this. But as we have seen, when you don't take the time, when you're not having the principles in place, you're likely to get pushed back and you're likely to slow yourself down. So we're doing this, we think, to help advance these, the public appreciation and understanding with policymakers as we go forward. And also, these ethical principles are intended to apply broadly, regardless of the specific climate intervention technology under consideration, including emerging technologies. So one of the considerations was, why are we lumping all these together? This covers CDR techniques. This covers some other emerging techniques you'll see in the report. It was a strategic decision to make it very high level and not get down into the nitty-gritty and what needs to happen in each particular technology, just to get the engagements that you need in terms of the public and the policymakers' ability to understand what's happening in this space. So we're now in outreach and engagement. We're representing this work at each of the COP meetings. We have been there for the last 3 years. We'll be there again this year. In most of the United Nations convenings, we'll have some representation there, including the representation is from members of the community who can speak on the behalf of what's happening in this space and the need for governance, the need for engagement. The United Nations process is very slow and cumbersome and messy, and we're learning that firsthand. But we're still pursuing that as a mean and working. We're not doing this in isolation. Working with other world bodies who are interested in the same thing. The WMO, for example, I think that was mentioned. We've seen some areas highlighted. We're in close coordination and conversations with those entities. Global translations are available. Again, the report is available in 10 different languages. We've had over 1,600 downloads so far. It's available for free for anybody who wants to read and use this as you engage in your own work. We are often invited to present, just at this conference, other conferences, but even in bilateral discussions. Any organization wants to have a discussion around these things, we have people who go in and talk and have dialogue in terms of how do we build this understanding and how do we advance the knowledge and awareness of the need for principles. Again, we're looking for additional partners on how we advance these principles. This is voluntary. We're not proposing that anybody come in and propose, you must do this. We're saying we as a community should adopt these voluntarily at this point in time. And we are also hoping, and in a conference like this, when you talk about an informal community of practice, I think what the degrees folks are doing is helping to engage of what we would call a community of practice, people working in this space who might have some common objectives here. So we've had a lot of global outreach. This was presented at the EGU meeting 2 weeks ago. It's going to be presented in Japan at the JPGU meeting next week. And again, we have a presentation at most of the United Nations conferences and any invited convenings, not just for SRM, excuse me, but also for oceans-related technology. Marine CDR is a very important topic, in some ways very troublesome as well for some of the things that are being proposed that don't have ethical guidance yet. So there's a QR code here, and you can contact me at any time or just go to Google AGU Ethical Framework. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes more. I will begin with you.
Thank you, Billy, and I'd like to thank the AGU team for this excellent work. And I have one question. So you guys have been doing excellent outreach and communication, but there's one thing AGU can do on its own. That is about journals. So when I do surveys, and when I write a journal article, submit something, a manuscript to a journal article, I have to show that I cleared the ethical review.
Yes.
Even however harmless my survey is. So let's say, for instance, the journal like risk analysis, you have to do it, whatever things you ask. And I'm just curious because you can implement some of the ethical principles by making certain requirements for AGU journals.
Right.
I don't know what the right balance is, of course, but obviously, you talked about the internal institutional review board, and so that the research, outdoor research, that's quite reasonable. But what about something in between? I have no idea, but that's something.
Yeah, thank you, Masa. And I know you've made that recommendation before in the advisory board. Thank you for being a member of the advisory board as well. And that is under consideration. I think the thought at this point was it was too soon because people weren't there yet. They wouldn't be able to publish. But we do have what we call fair data practices that we're trying to make sure all the authors have that. So we're implementing that now and making that a standard now. But I think this will follow. I can't say when, but it's a great recommendation. That is something that we have some control over. AGU publishes 24 peer-reviewed journals, and so we could do that, and it would drive some things, but it might drive some people to other journals as well. Who knows? Thank you.
Maybe the two together so we
Yeah.
can answer.
I guess my question is pretty simple. Do you have any examples of implementation at this point, like either a specific recommendation or like a research team that like went through and like I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that?
Okay.
Team.
And my question would be related to the first, is just a very brief comment. There is now like an expanding ethics methodology, and one possibility is like an on-site ethicist, like embedding researchers into projects. So one of our colleagues from Argentina, Paola Boedo, she works on this methodology, and it includes things like focus groups, it includes things like basically real-time on-site reflection. That's something that could be, I suppose, that be part of the question. Is that something that could make work?
Yeah, let me take that question first. So you're absolutely right, having some ethicists involved in when you're looking at these research we didn't get quite there. What we said was your team should have some social scientists or ethicists, I mean, you could say that's social science as well, involved as you're designing and planning. So having that as part of your research team engagement we think is important. And if you have some type of institutional review board, I think having somewhat of an ethics background could help. We consulted with ethicists as we were doing this, and that's a different language, and you got to get the words exactly right to meet their standards. So we're looking at it more from an applied ethics standpoint. But yeah, I've learned a lot, and the full team has learned a lot. I think you read the report. Anyone who reads the report will learn a lot as well from the ethicists who had strong input on the report.
There weren't so many ethicists. I didn't recognize many.
Yeah, and you're right. There were about 3 out of 40. Well, 43, you're right. And you can look at that and say, well, we didn't have the right Global South representation as well. So again, aspirational, and we don't want this to be a final deal. We're put on the shelf and go away and not worry about it. We see this as evolving. And Amanda, to your question, are there examples? There are some groups who have embraced this from the start. There's a group called the Carbon Business Council, and they have established not the exact same principles, but they have ethical principles that I don't know if they force it in their membership, but they do promote it with their membership. So we've had close coordination and close discussions with them and other groups as well in terms of the need for ethical principles. So the Carbon Business Council, these are people with startups, people who are actually out to do some work in the space. So they are promoting ethical principles, and they have from the start. So and there are a few other groups I could probably name. I don't want to start naming because I missed some. But I think that I'm encouraged by how far we have come in 2 years. Even before this was published in October 2024, there were groups already engaging in this space. We've been in ongoing discussion with anti-parking degrees, of course, from the beginning. We had close coordination with Climate Overshoot Commission back when Jess Reynolds was part of that. So there's a lot of dialogue between groups. I think they all are now saying you need ethical principles, and that wasn't always the case. I'm very encouraged, especially seeing the people who are here at this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks to you. I was asked to do like a sort of synthesis of what has been done, which is impossible in 1 minute. But I will say that at least I think that maybe it would have been better if we began with María Inés speaking about make sunsets, the problems it posed, then to see all the risk analysis that was proposed, and ending with Billy speaking about a possible ethical framework to work with. And I think there's a lot to be done in ethics in this field. There's a lot of thought to be done because it's very specific. And, well, let's hope this is the start of continuing having more meetings. And it is a pity that we have only one session, because it would have been great to continue the discussion in a more informal way. So thanks a lot for being here, and have a nice lunch. Bye.